Some of the most legendary cars in history weren't meticulously planned. They were born from desperation, bold risks, and sheer madness. In the automotive world, these machines are the equivalent of a last-second Hail Mary pass. Final, desperate attempts to turn things around. And sometimes, against all odds, they don't just succeed, they become icons. That's precisely what happened with the Porsche 930 Turbo, a car born out of necessity and uncertainty, poorly engineered, brutally unforgiving, and downright dangerous. Yet, it exploded onto the scene, shattered expectations, and redefined performance standards. Today, its legacy still looms large, shaping the DNA of every Porsche that followed. This is the story of the ultimate anti-hero in the 911 lineup, the flawed, ferocious machine that helped cement Porsche as a true sports car powerhouse. We might think of the 70s as a decade of great music, cheap gas, and astounding films. But from an automotive perspective, it was a terrible time. Stuck between the innovative 60s and flashy 80s, the 1970s were times of downsizing, recession, and catalytic converters choking big engines and producing small power. Even the sports cars were disgracefully slow. On both sides of the ocean, car companies struggled to maintain performance levels and meet environmental standards. However, the results were pretty disappointing. For example, the US spec 1974 Porsche 911 had a 2.7-liter flat-six engine with 143 horsepower in the base version and 167 horsepower in the Carrera S model. It was absurd that the 1974 model with the 2.7-liter engine was less potent than the 1972 model with a 2.4-liter unit. Yes, the 1974 911 was still dynamic due to its lightweight construction, but it was far from being a top performer. But losing power wasn't the only concern for Porsche. By the early 70s, the 911 was a 10-year-old model, and the sales started to decline. Global recession took its toll on production numbers, and tricky handling along with rust issues made the 911 a bit obsolete. Even Porsche engineers were slowly starting to abandon the 911. The consensus was that the technical concept of a sports car with a rear-mounted flat-six engine reached the end of its development. The 70s brought many cars with mid-mounted engines that outhandled the 911, and Porsche started to look outdated. The Porsche's board of directors was convinced that the future of the company was in front-engine models and allocated the funds for developing two such cars: the entry-level Porsche 924, which was engineered with Volkswagen and debuted in 1976, and the fantastic Porsche 928, powered with V8 engine and envisioned initially as the 911 replacement, debuting in 1978. In such a climate, the venerable 911 was like a once great rock band that hadn't had a hit single in years and was dangerously close to breaking up forever. Fortunately, the 911 was still pretty much dominant on the racing scene, both in America and Europe. The combination of dependable mechanics, tunable engine, and affordability made it a favorite with numerous private teams. On the track, Porsche cars were amongst the most successful, not just the 911s in Group 5 or SCCA championships, but also in prototype class and endurance racing. Environmental standards that choked the road-going models didn't apply to the racing cars, and Porsche could chase the lap times uninterrupted. The early 70s saw more and more racing teams experimenting with turbocharging. Although it wasn't all that new, the forced induction was very rarely seen in those days and still too complicated for many brands. Chevrolet and Oldsmobile pioneered it in the early 1960s with mixed success. But when BMW won the European Touring Championship in 1969 with the turbocharged car, Porsche took notice. In 1972, BMW presented the 2002 Turbo, the first European production car with turbocharging, and Porsche started using it on its Can-Am racing cars, easily outgunning all the competitors. It was just a matter of time before Porsche would bolt on turbochargers on the 911, and it happened in 1974 when the Porsche 935 was introduced. It was a thoroughbred racing car with a 3.3-liter turbocharged flat-six featuring mechanical fuel injection and insane power levels. In full competition specs and with turbo at maximum boost, the 935 could produce up to 850 horsepower, which is an insane number today, let alone in the 70s. However, the company needed a road-going turbocharged model for homologation purposes, which is how the 930 Turbo was born. Presented in late 1974 at the Paris Motor Show, the 930 Turbo was offered as a 1975 model in Europe and a year later in America. The initial idea behind the 930 Turbo was to sell just 400 cars. They needed to homologate the 935 for competition. Allowed as a specialty model, not a permanent addition to the 911 range, the 930 Turbo was very much different than anything on the market in those days. Even though the 930 used the same chassis, it was significantly wider than the 911 Carrera, with massive rear wheels, wheel arches, front splitter, wider front tires, and bigger brakes. The characteristic whale-tail rear spoiler was huge, but it was very much needed and covered a gem of an engine, a 3-liter flat-six engine with a single KKK turbocharger. The power output was 260 horsepower and 243 pound-feet of torque, representing a significant jump over the standard Carrera's output. The newfound power had a substantial effect on performance, and the 1975 930 Turbo could sprint to 60 miles per hour in just 5.2 seconds and could top 155 miles per hour, with mid-range acceleration that was unheard of. In the mid-70s, it was one of the fastest cars money could buy, and the successful implementation of new turbocharging technology brought 911 back into the focus of sports car enthusiasts all over the globe. To be honest, the original 1975 to 1977 Porsche 930 Turbo was a fast but crude car, totally different from the polished and well-mannered turbos of today. The company didn't invest a lot of time and resources in developing this model since it was nothing more than a homologation special. For example, the original 930 Turbo used only a 4-speed transmission, and no special equipment, and the limited slip differential was an option. It was also very expensive, with an MSRP of $29,000, which is over $165,000 today, adjusted for inflation. In comparison, the base 1975 Carrera was more than half of that. Amazingly, Porsche was swept with orders, and by 1977, it had sold just over 2,800 930 Turbos, which was a fantastic achievement. Apparently, more power and modern technology were what was needed to save the 911 on track and on the street. However, despite the stellar performance, the 930 Turbo had its dark side. When it was launched, the first road test uncovered its biggest flaw: handling. So, what is the big deal with 930's handling and how it became known as the Widowmaker? We must first remind you of the original 911 specifications and chassis construction to answer that question. In 1975, the most potent standard 911 was the Carrera, with 157 horsepower and 166 pound-feet of torque. As you know, the 911 had an engine mounted over the rear axle, which resulted in a 40 to 60 weight distribution. When creating the 930, Porsche installed a significantly more powerful engine, but kept the chassis construction and weight distribution mostly intact. Those mid-70s 911s had a short wheelbase of just under 90 inches, which helped handling. However, when you have such a light but powerful car with a short wheelbase and most of the weight concentrated over the rear axle, a sudden surge of power at 4,000 RPM due to turbo lag is known to send the car into immediate and often fatal oversteer, which is impossible to control. Back in the mid-70s, turbo technology was new, especially in sports cars, so drivers didn't know what to expect, and many were caught off guard and sent into the ditch in a split second. Spirited driving in the rain was equal to suicide, especially with the tires that were available in those days. With improvements on later cars, handling was changed a little bit, but not even Porsche could bend the laws of physics and make the 930 Turbo more forgiving. Even though it was a flawed masterpiece, the 930 Turbo was a fantastic machine, especially considering how bleak the sports car market was in the mid-70s. There wasn't a better choice for buyers looking for performance and excitement, since this car had it all: looks, performance, and mystique, and a whole lot of danger. This is why it attracted owners who either had racing experience or were known to enjoy driving fast cars. One of the most notable names was legendary Hollywood actor Steve McQueen, who bought a brand new 930 Turbo as soon as it became available in the US. and it was his last car that he purchased new. At the same time, the various versions of the racing Porsche 935 dominated the championships and set new track records. The sheer performance of the 930 Turbo and the trophies that the 935 brought home made the Porsche board think twice about discontinuing the 911. Encouraged by the original 1975-77 930 Turbo success, Porsche developed this model into something more than just a homologation special. So, in 1978, the significantly upgraded model was introduced. This time, the engine was enlarged to 3.3 liters of displacement, which resulted in 300 horsepower and, more importantly, a significant rise in torque figure. In order to provide sufficient cooling, the intercooler was part of the package, as well as bigger brakes, stiffer suspension, wider tires, and a few aero details for more downforce and airflow, especially in the rear of the car. The chassis and the new 5-speed get-rag manual were also improved, replacing the outdated 4-speed box. The result was a significantly faster and better-mannered car with a 0 to 60 mph time of 4.8 seconds and a top speed of over 160 mph. Suspension changes resulted in more domesticated road behavior, although the 930 was still more dangerous to drive than some competitors. It was still expensive, but had more interior comfort and was easier to live with. Astonishingly, Porsche kept the 930 in production until 1989 as its top-of-the-line model. What is even more impressive is just how influential this model proved to be and how it could survive for so long with only a few minor modifications. The 930 Turbo was withdrawn from the US market in 1980 due to emissions issues, but returned in 1986, available as a coupe, convertible, or Targa. When the production of the 930 stopped in 1989, Porsche made almost 19,000 of those second-generation models and nearly 22,000 of all the 930 Turbos, which is the magnificent success that helped save the 911 as a model from its demise. Born out of the dark days of sports car performance, the 930 Turbo became one of the symbols of Porsche's relentless quest for power and speed. Even though it was well below the brand standards in development and refinement, it was a brutally effective and blistering fast machine that helped 911 survive the lack of interest and loss of power. Far from perfect, and pretty deadly in inexperienced hands. For almost 15 years, the 930 was an institution amongst the Porsche connoisseurs and everybody looking for dependable machines that can match the Italian exotics in just about any measurable metric. But above all, it was an incredibly foreseeing machine that promoted turbocharging as a new standard in the car industry. Interestingly, 40 years after Porsche presented the 930 Turbo, forced induction became the standard for the 911 range, showing just how influential and essential this Widowmaker really was.